4 days later, Edward received a small package. Inside the knapsack was some food, cold roast meat, a piece of bread, and a few oranges. Everything was wrapped in the latest newspapers. Edward carefully smoothed out the papers to catch up on news from France and the kingdom. There was no note in the package, but as he began reading the newspapers, he noticed that certain words or parts of sentences on one page were underlined, forming a cryptic message together. Father, wasn't pleasant. It's not safe now, come. The surprise arrived, for, betrothal, hopefully nothing comes of it. It's about a rather dull piece. Studying, botany, expedition, village. I'm thinking of you. Praying. Edward read the message twice, then leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. His mind drifted back to a vision he'd had long ago, perhaps 7 years earlier. At the time, his younger brother was getting married, and Edward was constantly lectured about how he should settle down as well. He, too, longed for it. But God had clearly told him the time wasn't right. Then, a vivid scene had flashed before his eyes. He was sitting on a beach, watching 2 little girls playing in the sand, building something. The woman beside him was pregnant again. She gently rubbed her growing belly and looked at Edward hesitantly. Do you think this time it'll be a boy, or will we have another little girl? She asked. Maybe we'll have 4 prophetess daughters, like Philip the Evangelist, Edward replied cheerfully. When he saw that his wife didn't laugh, he took her hands and looked into her eyes earnestly. I'm absolutely certain we'll have a son one day, and honestly, I don't care whether it's this time or later. God has brought us through fire and given us so much that I, for one, am truly grateful and content. And I'll be grateful even if we end up with 7 little girls. The young woman looked into his eyes intently and then smiled. Edward had remembered that look and smile for years. He would recognize it anywhere and knew that the woman in his vision was Letty. You're in love, aren't you? A voice suddenly interrupted, and Edward opened his eyes. His cellmate was sitting on his bunk, eyeing him curiously. What? Edward looked at him, confused. Just saying, you've got a stupid dreamy grin, the man said. Edward had never been so glad to see the guards, who appeared at the door just then with a broom and bucket. He really didn't want to answer that question. He felt, however, that he couldn't have met Letty at a worse time. Her smiles, teasing, and direct questions echoed in his mind all day. He couldn't wait to see her again. He couldn't help feeling impatient. He wished he could talk to her from morning till night, whenever he wanted. And now, he'd received this strange message about her father planning to betroth her. Paradoxically, he could more easily imagine God guiding him through the trial set to take place in a few days than envision a future where he could court the one he wanted to pursue. Edward was genuinely surprised when Letty appeared the day after sending him a message that it wasn't safe for her to visit. The captain led him back to the front room, this time without putting shackles on him, only reminding him to stay on his side of the room. He had mixed feelings about seeing Letty again. I'm very glad to see you, Miss Letty, but is it a good idea for you to be here? Aren't you risking anything? I'd hate for you to get into trouble with your father. Nicolette shrugged. My father isn't well, and I have to take advantage of that before he recovers and starts paying attention to what I'm doing. I don't know when I'd get another chance to come here. It's forbidden, and if he found out, I'd probably be in serious trouble. Couldn't someone tell him? Edward asked with concern, his gaze instinctively drifting to the door behind which the captain stood. Nicolette shook her head. A little blackmail can work wonders, she replied. I think I'm safe. But tell me, how are you doing? I hope all the local criminals are already preparing to serve God for the rest of their lives. Edward smiled. I'm sharing a cell with a brothel owner who has a lot of questions. Otherwise, there's no one else. I occasionally run into other prisoners during certain duties we have here. I prayed for the healing of a limping pirate, and God touched him instantly. Within moments, he was walking perfectly normally, and I think he'd be very open to a conversation, but we didn't have time for that. I should ask the captain to do something about it, Nicolette said thoughtfully. This is a waste of your potential. They should bring you 2 or 3 new criminals every morning, prepare a washtub for you to baptize them in the evening, and bring you new ones the next day. You can't just sit here staring at the wall when there are so many people you could reach." Edward smiled, thinking it was half a joke, but to his surprise, Nicolette stood up, called for the captain to come in for a moment, and, in a rather authoritative tone, gave him a short lecture about how God can transform the lives of even the most hardened criminals and that it would be good for Edward to speak with as many of them as possible. The captain listened silently, then gave a casual salute and said with a hint of amusement, "As you command, young lady." "Any further orders?" Nicolette pretended to think for a moment before adding, "Sure, I think it wouldn't hurt for you to listen to some of Mr. Sandcreek's preaching as well. So, when you bring him those criminals, stay there for a while and hear what he has to say. That's all." The captain bowed more seriously this time and retreated back behind the door. Nicolette turned back to Edward, who was watching her in astonishment, and smiled. "When I was a little girl, the captain, who wasn't a captain back then, taught me to ride a horse. We spent a lot of time together. We have a friendly relationship and have always teased each other. I know what I can get away with." Edward gave a weak smile and nodded, but his mind was racing with more questions. There was something very authoritative in the way Letty carried herself, and her behavior puzzled him. She was wearing the same simple dress as before, and on one hand, she acted like an ordinary girl, but what ordinary girl would be taught to ride by one of the king's soldiers? Though his thoughts were heading in the right direction, Edward couldn't figure out who he was speaking to. His mind wandered to various military dignitaries, wondering how old the children of the king's captain or the port's commander might be. He didn't want to pry, though, and there was one simple reason for that. If it came to mentioning the mysterious message he'd received at his trial, he wanted to be able to say with a clear conscience that he didn't know who had sent it. "There was a sentence underlined in those newspapers about some fiancé," he said, steering the conversation to a new topic. "May I know what that was about?" Nicolette sighed. That was a truly unpleasant surprise. During the week, she quickly corrected herself, nearly saying Duke, "a certain young man came to visit us. My father invited him so I could meet him. He tried to set me up with someone from France before, but thankfully that fell through. His first choice didn't meet my idea of a godly husband, and it took a lot of effort to explain to my father that I'd like him to respect my faith in this matter. He sees Christianity more as tradition, morality, and ancestral heritage, but nothing more personal. This second choice of his is noticeably better, and if I didn't think it wasn't meant to be, I probably wouldn't be so dismissive and would consider him. But as it is, I'm thinking about how to get out of it." Edward nodded silently, and Nicolette continued. "His name is Pierre, and he has a funny surname. When I first heard it, it quite amused me. But I'd rather not share more personal details for now. Pierre is from La Rochelle and is a passionate botanist. A perfect cure for insomnia, I'd say, because his detailed talk about every petal could put even a morning person to sleep. But otherwise, there's nothing wrong with him. He's 3 years older than me, educated, and of suitable social standing. And though he's from France, he's a converted Christian. He had a tutor from this island who brought him to the Lord. He was someone from the lineage of Alain Leroy, the man who translated the Bible with the famous Nikeola Raynar. A funny surname and a tutor from the Leroy family?" Edward repeated, confused. "Something like Pierre Noël, Christmas stone?" "I see you really know everyone," Nicolette said, blushing, realizing she'd hinted at more than she intended. "Letty, Alain Leroy was my great-great-grandfather. His grandson married one of Nicolas Renard's granddaughters, my grandmother, so the tutor we're talking about is my cousin Philippe Leroy, who carries his father's family name. My mother was Antoinette Leroy before she married my father, Edward Sandcreek, during a stay in England. He died when I was 2, and she returned to the island and soon remarried," Edward explained. "It's a small world," Nicolette remarked. "And Pierre Noël is quite well known, wealthy, and noble," Edward added. "I know far less about you than I'd like, but I'd venture to guess that these simple clothes you're wearing for the second time are actually the only plain item in your wardrobe, and you got them just so you could visit me here discreetly." Nicolette gave an embarrassed smile and looked away. After a moment, she looked back at Edward with a mischievous expression and asked, Is that a word of knowledge or a prophetic gift or whatever it's called? I'm not entirely clear on all these spiritual gifts. I might need some tutoring. I feel more and more foolish for letting you get as much out of me as you did the first time, Edward admitted quietly. And I can't imagine how such a vision could ever come true. I shouldn't have told you about it at all. There's clearly an enormous social gap between us. Nicolette shrugged. Bigger than you can imagine, she replied seriously. But that house with the octagonal tower you described is our summer residence. For now, we'll both have to be content with the fact that God knows something we don't. Edward nodded silently, and at that moment, the bells began to toll, one after another, slowly and deeply. It started with the largest bell, a low death knell, and then the others joined in, until soon every bell in the city was ringing. Nicolette listened to the bells in stunned confusion. Edward bit his lip and quietly tuned into the sounds resonating through the prison. The captain of the guard wasn't immediately certain what was happening, but after a moment, there was no doubt. He opened the door and looked at the princess gravely. I think you should come with me at once, miss, he said to her. What's happening? Nicolette asked. She had her suspicions but didn't want to believe him fully. The king had complained of feeling unwell the previous evening, hadn't come to breakfast that morning, had sent for the court physician, and stayed in bed. But it was now 3 in the afternoon, and Nicolette didn't want to believe events could unfold so quickly. May I answer that question in front of Mr. Sandcreek? The captain asked. The princess glanced at Edward for a second and then nodded. The captain knelt before her, looked up, and said in a solemn tone, Long live the Queen. He quickly stood and gestured to her. You should come with me immediately, Your Majesty. Everyone is surely looking for you. Nicolette rose quickly from the table, still unable to believe what was happening. She looked at Edward, who stared at her wide-eyed, his hand covering his mouth. Only when Nicolette stood did he react, albeit with a slight delay, and quickly dropped to his knees before her. The new queen gave him one desperate, frightened look and rushed toward the door without a word. The guards led Edward back to his cell, and he gazed out the small window toward the sky, for the first time in a long while at a loss for words. Within half an hour, he heard the familiar jingle of keys, and the captain of the guard appeared at the bars. Pack up any personal belongings you have, the captain instructed. If I'm not mistaken, Her Highness has tasked you with converting the entire prison, so I'm taking you to a different cell. Want to have a chat with a murderer, or would you prefer a group of ordinary pirates? The captain asked. Edward gave a wry smile. Got anything lighter for me today? He asked. I'm still a bit in shock. An old man who beat the local baker with his cane because he broke a tooth on a stone, the captain suggested. Edward laughed and shook his head in disbelief. Are you serious? He asked, confirming. I think I'd appreciate some tips on staying in such good shape in old age, though I plan to channel my energy elsewhere. I thought you were the one supposed to be giving advice around here, the captain reminded him. Anyway, your chances of keeping that head of yours on your shoulders have significantly improved this afternoon. Edward looked at the captain hesitantly, unsure of what to say. Speaking of heads, I saw how Her Highness, or rather, Queen Nicolette, was looking at you, the captain remarked quietly. It would be wise, especially at this moment, not to turn her head any further. Write her a nice book, dedicate it with heartfelt thanks to the Queen, and stay out of her way, if I may offer some advice. If you'd like, I can accommodate you in that regard. I can arrange for you to spend a few hours alone each day in that room with the table and bring you a stack of paper. Thank you for the offer, Edward said, looking at him. Truth be told, I don't have any ideas at the moment, unless I write about how I became a devoted admirer of the monarchy in just 1 hour. The captain nudged Edward into the hallway. I think the aggressive old man will be the most suitable company for you right now. And if you overdo it with this monarchy admiration, I'll personally return his cane to him. Maybe just a bucket of cold water would do the trick, Edward remarked, biting his lip guiltily. The captain laughed but chose not to comment on the remark. He pushed Edward into the cell and then stepped back just far enough to be out of sight from the cell but close enough to overhear their conversation.